Welcome to Comics Recollected. This is Siskoid of Siskoid's Blog of Geekery, and you're listening to the October 1983 episode. We're going back in time to my early days of buying, reading, and collecting comics to see what I might remember from the issues I actually got my hands on at the time. I was just getting into the X-Men when X-Men and the Micronauts came out, a 4-issue limited series that merged the two properties really well because they had both Chris Claremont and Bill Mantlo, who were each of the team's writers, working on the same script with Butch Guice on art. And I don't remember much from the issue. Obviously, the X-Men get shrunk down and go to the Microverse. That's obvious. And the New Mutants did feature in the prologue at X-Mansion, which meant I was pretty close to trying their book out, although I would never become as much of a fan of the New Mutants as I was of the X-Men. Micronauts were not something I didn't know anything about. I knew the Micronauts because I had some of the toys when I was a kid. Of course, the toys in the comics don't have a whole lot to do with each other. Bill Mantlo was an expert at taking toys without much backstory to them and creating amazing comics from them, really. He did the same with Rom Space Knight. So I'd had some toys, which had nothing to do with the comic, and I did have one early issue of Micronauts in my house when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. It was a coverless copy of what turned out to be Micronauts number 3. I had to track it down eventually. Because the comic disappeared. I don't know what it was doing there. Probably an aunt or uncle. They were into comics and brought usually Richie Rich and Archie and Hot Stuff, Casper, that kind of thing to the house for the kids. And that's how I learned to read English, really. But this was, I guess, the first Marvel comic I ever owned, this Micronauts number 3, which I don't have anymore. At least I don't have that copy. I was still reading Fury of Firestorm, The Nuclear Man at this point. This is number 19. An odd issue, but one that really stayed with me because it was about this character called Goldenrod, the villain, who is a kind of plant man. And at the end, it's kind of grim. He pollinates, he explodes into pollen and never came back. What's really odd about it is that it's got Gene Colan art, which you wouldn't think he'd be a good match for Firestorm. I'm still not sure. Flipping through the issue now, I'm not sure he is a good match for something like Firestorm, which is colorful and vibrant. But he does give the story the spookiness it deserves. I'll put up a picture of his Firestorm on the blog, and you can judge for yourself if he's doing a good job with it. Seems I tried Wonder Woman at this point, number 311, which is not a good comic. It's towards the end of the run, maybe less than 2 years out. And what you can see from the cover, it's got gremlins on the invisible plane, so maybe it's a Twilight Zone joke that I didn't get at the time, and I'm not too sure. The interiors have art by Don Heck, and the cover is by Ross Andrew, neither of which are favorite artists of mine, although the cover, I think, is superior to the interiors. What was most interesting about the issue, and would have been the reason I would have bought the next one, is the Huntress backup. It's got Huntress fighting alligators in the sewers. The villain is Earthworm. So that was a lot more interesting than the Wonder Woman script, sadly. But the backup wasn't enough for me to get another issue. Yes, Uncanny XMen number 177. It's got a cover with Wolverine having killed Kitty Pryde, and that's just the tip of the iceberg because there's this whole opening sequence that features Mystique basically killing or maiming every single X-Men. Except Nightcrawler, because he might be her son, and that's the subplot they're laying in there. It's all a big simulation at Arcade's Murder World, but still, it's pretty striking. And what's most striking is the very end of the issue where Colossus gets all melted. So there might be an actual X-Man death at the end. So it's a bit of twists and turns and fake outs. Great art. It's John Romita Jr. being inked by his dad, John Romita Sr. So Jr. and Sr. together make a very solid art team. Beautiful work. Another issue of New Adventures of Superboy, this one number 49. Again, as usual, there's a nice Gil Kane cover. And as usual, Gil Kane is nowhere to be seen in the interiors, which are mostly by Kurt Schaffenberger. The story is not a memorable one. I flipped through it before doing this video, and I was surprised to find Zatara has a little guest starring role in there. Okay. And also Dynamind, which was a villain from the early issues I bought, who reappears and has a little role to play, but not as a villain. Really, I'm buying this for the Dial H for Hero backup. So DC's having a lot of success with backups for me at this time, where the main features are, pretty standard superhero stuff that very Bronze Age, but could almost be Silver Age sometimes. So the Dial H is the final chapter of that backup, which meant I wasn't, New Adventures of Superboy wasn't long for this world in my book. And the very end is, strangely, features an origin story of Robbie Reed and the original Dial, rehashing events that were in those original comics. It's a weird way to end. It's more of an epilogue than a real climax. Although it ends with Vicky and Chris and Nick, their friend Nick, who's been drawing superheroes, and then they've been becoming these superheroes. So Nick joining the team with Robbie's old Dial. And then there were 3, it says. Unfortunately, and then there were none, because the Dial H characters would reappear, guest star in Teen Titans, and Vicky's being turned into a villain, and then the Dial would get lost and reused by different people. But for Chris and Vicky and Nick, this was pretty much, really the end of the road, heroically speaking. And we end, as we always seem to do, with World's Finest Comics, number 299, Superman Batman, once again, despite the really interesting cover, they're still struggling against the Pantheon, which are strange, Kirby-esque gods. And notably, the issue is drawn by Gene Colan again. So Gene Colan, having done 2 comics this month, the first time he was doing Firestorm, real superheroics. This time he's doing Kirby's Celestials kind of thing. So, he's versatile, but the comics always have that same spookiness, that same horror edge, which may or may not be the right tone for any of these comics. Again, don't have this issue anymore. I traded it for older Marvel comics from a classmate, which we'll get to eventually. As usual, if you'd like to find out more about my comic book journey, or indeed any piece of geekery that interests me, you can go to siskoid.blogspot.com or look at the links under this video, which should point you towards specific posts about the comics we discussed today. So until next time, this is Siskoid waving to you from the past.